The Cold War, 1953 till 1962. The year 1953 was very important because Stalin died. He was replaced as first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union by Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev started a policy to reform some of Stalin's measures. This policy was called the process of de-Stalinization. On the West, Harry Truman was replaced as President of the United States by Dwight David Eisenhower, former Army Chief of Staff during World War II. However, these new presidents did not prevent the continuation of conflicts around the world. So let's see some of them. The Hungarian Revolution. One conflict was the Hungarian Revolution. In Hungary, there was a wave of critics and students' protests against the Soviet regime. But this happened after Stalin's death. These protests led to a huge popular demonstration. The Hungarian army joined the demonstration asking for freedom. And everything changed into a revolution when fights between pro-Soviets and demonstrators started. Hungary tried to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact and ask a kind of help by the United Nations. Finally, Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, commanded the occupation of Budapest by the troops of the Warsaw Pact, and then the Hungarian Revolution was eliminated. 13,000 Hungarians were sent to prison, and 350 executed. Former Interior Minister, the pro-Sovietic Janos Kadar, was appointed leader of the country. The Berlin Wall. A different kind of conflict happened in Germany, specifically in Berlin. Remember that Berlin was divided into 4 administrative areas, and later the French, United States and United Kingdom areas were put together into only one. So Berlin actually was divided into 2 zones. The Western zone, the capitalist zone, capitalist Berlin, and the Eastern, the communist Berlin, the capital city of the Democratic Republic of Germany. Since that moment, West Berlin started developing economically much better than East Berlin, and that meant that a lot of people from East Berlin emigrated to West Berlin, and from West Berlin to West Germany. By 1961, the amount of people who left East Germany was so huge that the Soviet authorities stopped this mass migration, building a wall to prevent people crossing from one side to the other one. This wall divided and separated both Berlins for 28 years. The Eastern Guards received shoot-to-kill orders to prevent people from escaping East Berlin. Around 200 people were killed trying to reach the west side of the city. But 5,000 Berliners successfully defected and arrived to West Berlin and to West Germany. The Suez Crisis. In the boundary between Europe and Asia, there is a strategic country and a very important key location. That's Egypt and the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is a waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean via the Red Sea. It was constructed by the French explorer and engineer Linand de Villefort and opened in 1869. Later, in 1875, Great Britain acquired stock shares and took control since Egypt became a British protectorate. And you remember the unit about imperialism. So Britain had colonies and had protectorates. For example, Egypt was one of these examples, one protectorate. Suez Canal was, and nowadays is, a strategic location because it enables a more direct route for shipping between Europe and Asia without circumnavigating the African continent. 11 years after the Second World War, in 1956, the British authorities withdrew from the Suez Canal and from Egypt and handed the control, at least the political and military control of the Suez Canal, to the Egyptian authorities. Although a British-French company was ruling the administration of the canal. The president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, quickly moved to nationalize the canal's operations in July 1956. And in response, in October 1956, troops from Britain, France, and Israel threatened to invade Egypt, leading to the so-called Suez Crisis, or the Second Arab-Israeli War. Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula and defeated the Egyptian army, although Egypt blocked the canal to all shipping by sinking boats. Heavy political pressure from the United States and from the USSR led to a withdrawal. The Canadian Secretary of State for External Affairs, Lester B. Pearson, recommended the establishment of a United Nations peacekeeping force, the first of its kind, to protect the canal and to ensure access to everybody. The United Nations ratified Pearson's proposal on November 4, 1956. The Cuban Missile Crisis. In the Caribbean there was a conflict, and that one was the closest moment we were to a full-scale atomic war. Everything happened in Cuba, where the revolutionary Fidel Castro was the prime minister, after his guerrilla movement ended the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in 1958. But the conflict started in 1961, when the United States Intelligence Agency supported an invasion of Cuba by a group of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. This invasion, known as Battle of Bay of Pigs, was a fail, but Fidel Castro feared future invasions by the United States, so he established closer ties with the USSR, proclaiming his country as a communist one. And 1 year later, in 1962, the United States deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey, close to the USSR. Of course, the leader of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, considered this act as a threat and responded placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. You placed missiles close to the Soviet Union, I placed missiles close to the United States. When a United States spy plane found out the missile facilities in Cuba, the President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, established a naval blockade on October 22nd to prevent further missiles from reaching Cuba. The United States announced it would not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba, and demanded that the weapons already in Cuba could be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev answered that first the United States should dismantle the missiles deployed in Turkey. Tension was at its maximum because Russian boats were approaching Cuba, transporting more missiles, and the United States had the blockade ready to fight against these boats. A confrontation like that would mean the beginning of an atomic war. Because of that, people were terribly scared, especially in the United States. So people left their jobs and they went home to die with their families. So tension was really high. After several days of tense negotiations, an agreement was reached between the United States and the Soviet Union. Publicly, the Soviets would dismantle their offensive weapons in Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union, subjected to a United Nations verification, in exchange for a United States public declaration and agreement to avoid invading Cuba again. The United States agreed that it would dismantle all United States-built Jupiter ballistic missiles which had been deployed in Turkey against the Soviet Union.